the folks for listening a little more about myself and a bit about the book, and then we can dive into aging and geroscience.
And a reminder too about the Q&A tab that's on the top. That's a great place to ask questions as we're going along, and we'll probably get to them at the end rather than during the presentation, but if they look like they coincide, we'll try and embed them into the presentation too. Right. Okay.
The slide didn't advance yet. Sometimes it does this thing where the screen sharing gets stuck. We're all becoming experts in Zoom.
Maybe if you tell me it looked like it,
perfect.
I might need to press the button.
So like Sean, so it's nice to meet all of you guys. Thanks for joining us this morning. Like Sean said, I'm a physician scientist. So I'm a geriatrician, meaning I'm a doctor. I subspecialize in geriatric medicine, which cares for the unique problems of older adults. I do that work at UCSF and particularly the San Francisco VA. But most of the time I'm a scientist. I'm a basic scientist. I run a laboratory at the Buck Institute, studying the basic biology of aging. And we'll talk a lot more about how that's a thing. A bit of science and biology that we can study, we can understand, and maybe most interestingly, we can manipulate. And this is becoming relevant now to clinical practice. We call that geroscience, the application of the basic science of aging to improve human health, to treat disease, and help to preserve function and independence as we age. And maybe Sean, you can go to the next slide about the Buck Institute. So if you guys haven't heard of the Buck Institute, it was the first scientific research institute founded entirely to study aging biology over 20 years ago. It was founded in 1999 on that beautiful IMPA designed campus up in Novato. It's independent, meaning it's its own institution. It's not part of UCSF or UC Berkeley or anything like that. It's supported in small part by the Buck Foundation, but most of the funding is from the federal government, from National Institutes on Health grants to do research. More than half of the budget of the Buck Institute comes from the NIH. So this is a common and important thing to know about biomedical research. It's mostly supported by the government, by the NIH, including what I hope you'll think is exciting research about applying aging to health. So the Buck is a really cool place to work because it's this unusual place that's completely devoted to a mission. It involves every scientific discipline. So usually you have like a department of biochemistry and a department of geriatrics, or a department of anatomy. But at the Buck, it's an aging institute. So we have people who do high technology, mass spectrometry, proteomics. We have people who are worm biologists and fly biologists and yeast biologists. We have mouse biologists. We have people who do work with human stem cells. Every different scientific discipline all together in one roof, but all focused on the common theme of aging. So it's a really cool place to work because I've never been in a place is so collaborative, where you have so many people doing so many different things, and you can reach out and use each other's expertise to answer these big questions about, why we age and how we can apply that to human health.
Let's see. So this was trying to frame the initial part of this presentation vis-a-vis questions and the concept of the universality of aging, but really, what is it? Why does it happen? What are the triggers? How much of those triggers are genetic? How much of those triggers are environmental? And importantly, in relation to something Dr. Newman just mentioned, how has our ability to study the science of aging changed in the recent past? So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide.
So aging is a biological process, and one of the ways that we've learned to think about aging isn't just for older folks. Aging is all of us. It truly is universal, not just that it happens to every one of us, but it's actually an ongoing process throughout our lives. So one way to think about aging and to think about different kind of phases of life is we've learned that the biology that causes aging, that causes what we see as aging, is a result of this kind of tension throughout our lives between the forces of damage and injury. Life necessarily involves damage. Your mitochondria produce energy, but they also produce free radicals. You know, your cells make proteins to very, very fine tolerances, perfectly folded, but gradually entropy starts to win and they unfold and they fold in the wrong ways. And this contributes to disease. But our bodies and our cells also have these powerful pathways to repair problems, to repair damage, and to provide us resilience. And when we're young, these are really potent and they work really well. And this is one of the reasons why when we're young, we're more resilient to just about anything that life throws at us. As we get older, in middle age, we start to feel a little bit more imbalanced there. I'm definitely feeling that now. And then when we're older, we lose some of that resilience. And we you know, some of the words that we use for that are like frailty, or, you know, vulnerability. You know, when we're older, we know that things will have more of an impact on us. And a lot of the art of being a geriatrician is preventing that, and helping to keep people healthy even as their resilience is less. My favorite example to kind of put this in concrete terms is, you know, the same problem, exactly the same problem that affects a younger person and an older person can have vastly different consequences just because of aging. I had an undergraduate, or I still have a fantastic undergraduate technician working in my lab doing science. He likes to skateboard, and last year he fell off his skateboard and he broke his arm, broke his long bone in his arm. And it wasn't really good for his lab work because, you know, he couldn't pipette anymore until it healed, but it didn't actually affect his life. He had a cast for a few weeks. He was fine, went on with his life. The cast came off, no problem. He actually broke it again a few months later. He was still fine afterwards. Breaking a long bone was no big deal. An older person who breaks a long bone, say a long bone in your leg, like your femur, which is attached to your hip, you know, a hip fracture is a life-changing event often for an older person, and even a life-ending event. It's as serious as having a metastatic cancer. Part of, you know, my job in the hospital is to try to manage that more effectively to help people recover from this really serious trauma of having a broken bone. It's the same thing. It's a broken bone, but aging makes that single thing affect people very differently at different stages in their lives. And Sean, you can show the next slide. So,
Slide.
So one of the fun things about aging is that, you know, again, I specialize in older folks, but you can actually measure and quantify aging throughout our lives. And my favorite example of this is baseball. I don't know if you're a baseball fan, Sean. I'm a big Mets fan going way back. But baseball's kind of fun because it's a very quantitative sport. You know, you can measure lots of things. You can measure really clearly is the slope of age-related decline as ball players get through their 30s. So this is Willie Mays, you know, one of the greatest baseball players to ever live. And even Willie Mays started to get old in his 30s. He hit the most home runs he ever hit around age 34. And steadily dropped off after that. So if you measure things carefully enough, like, you know, the incredibly hard task of hitting a baseball, you can actually measure aging even in their 30s.
And I assume that's a similar drop off as almost all those ball players make at that point in time. Is that fair? Or how much variability is there between players, I guess?
Well, you know, some of the greatness actually comes from delaying that drop off. You know, the Hall of Famers are
Right.
the ones who are not just really good ball players, but they're really good ball players who stay really good for longer than other folks. If you're kind of a stats geek, you know, ask about how consistent this is. You can go to, you know, baseball stats websites, and they'll actually show you the predictions of how your favorite player is going to perform over the next 4 or 5 years as they start to age. It's really kind of interesting and quantitative, and no one's beaten it yet. You know, there's no all-stars who are 60 years old.
Right. Let's see.
So aging throughout life, it's not just about you could, you know, kind of measure. We all probably feel changes in our bodies, right? But it's also that how your health now, or even your health earlier in life, can be one of the most important determinants of what your health is going to be like later on. So this is the idea that you kind of build up your health when you're younger so that you will be healthier when you're older. And there's a couple of ways in which we've gotten very quantitative about this. If you ask an osteoporosis specialist, what is the most important time to treat osteoporosis? Of course, osteoporosis is mostly a disease of older people. Thinning of the bones or risk for hip fractures and other fractures. There's lots of medicines to treat it for people who are older. But the most important time to treat it is actually when you're an adolescent, in your teens, when you need to build up that bone strength to begin with, that bone strength that you will then carry through the rest of your life. The same is true for muscle strength. We know that for almost everyone, even if you're really big into exercising, which is fantastic and helpful, even Jack LaLanne gradually got weaker as he got older. We lose muscle mass and we lose muscle strength much more slowly if we're active and exercising, which is why it's so important. But still, we lose muscle mass and strength. How much muscle mass and strength we have early in life determines how much muscle strength we're going to retain later in life. So if you want to be, strong and fit and independent later in life, you need to make sure your muscles are strong and fit earlier in life to give yourself that account to draw down on. So aging really is a thing throughout our lives. And then tying this back into the biology, we're talking about things like hitting home runs and bone density. But on the next slide, Sean, I like to say that you can quantify all these things as clinical phenotypes like bone density, but you can also measure them more specifically in like our muscles, how strong are our individual muscles, our muscle fibers. And this is also reflected in the biology of aging that's happening in our molecules and our cells. You can measure and quantify these things now throughout every stage of life, from the cellular to the organ system, right up to the whole person. So what are these cellular molecular things? I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's been a real revolution in the past 30 years of understanding, what are these molecular and cellular processes and pathways that determine how and why we age. These are often now called the hallmarks of aging, sort of a grab bag. This is, the spin your wheel of fortune for all the molecular processes that drive aging. And some of these are probably familiar to folks, like stem cells and stem cells getting exhausted with telomeres, probably a lot of folks have heard of. Protein folding, how our mitochondria work. Cellular senescence, which is a process that's leading, one of the key processes that's leading to drug development that's informing clinical trials now. But we really have a pretty good understanding of a lot of these molecular mechanisms, understanding how they work, and in the laboratory, figuring out how to manipulate them experimentally to show how important they are for aging. And now many of these are leading to drug discovery and clinical trials that target phenotypes of aging in people. So how would that work? Like, what is this probably still sounds kind of crazy to all you folks out there. What does it mean to like target aging? How does aging actually affect health? We'll probably talk more about this. How do you measure and define the effect of aging to know if so you think you have a drug that affects aging? How do you know if it works? This is how I think about aging and health as a geriatrician. So on the one hand, aging is the major risk factor for most of the chronic diseases that most affect our lives, and as doctors that we mostly treat. So everything from diabetes to Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to strokes to osteoporosis, all these things, aging is the major risk factor. And we often don't think about that because we don't think of aging as something we can modify or treat. Cardiovascular disease, you think about hypertension, your blood pressure. Think about your lipids and should you be on a statin. You think about like your aspirin, stop smoking, treat diabetes. These are all super important for lowering your cardiovascular risk. But the risk produced as we age dwarfs all those other risks. Not to say that those are not important, they're super important to treat. But if we could reduce that age-produced risk even a little bit, it would have a huge impact. So one thing about aging is it's a risk factor for disease. Aging is not a disease, but it's a risk factor for disease. And then there's all these changes that happen to our bodies that we all feel, which aren't diseases. They're just how our bodies change with age. A few of the ones that doctors pay the most attention to. I already mentioned how bone density and muscle mass can decline with age. If those reach a certain point, we call them diseases like osteoporosis. Our kidney function changes pretty predictably with age. And other things too. So aging produces these other changes in our bodies that can contribute to, how healthy we are and how much we can do the things we want to do. And then there's this idea that aging is the lens, the processor through which any health stress that we face is kind of processed. So the example of the broken bone from earlier, the difference between a broken bone that you put in a cast for a couple of months and you're fine, and a broken bone that comes with a 50-50 chance of dying in a year or two. The only difference there is the state of the aging in the person to whom that broken bone happens. So this idea that aging is how problems are expressed in our lives. So through these three things, risk for diseases, changes due to age, and then how age affects the impact of any health stress. This is how aging affects our risks for disability, our risks for losing our independence, and even our risk for dying.
So you'd made a comment previously, or actually maybe I'd heard this elsewhere, that longevity had improved any generation since about the 1850s. Will that persist is a question I have today. And related to that, how will our current epidemics of diabetes and other chronic diseases impact our nation's what has been continuously expanding longevity really throughout history?
Yeah, this is really remarkable, Sean, and I think this is something a lot of people don't appreciate when we start talking about like studying aging. A common question people ask is, this is going to change things, right? If we suddenly start living longer, we are living longer. We've been living longer for a while now. It's really a remarkable time to be alive for many of us, at least, not for all of us. But this is one of my favorite pieces of data to share. This is a graph of the longest average lived society on the planet Earth at any given point in time. So in different countries, basically, what's the average lifespan in different countries? And the country that's the healthiest, so to speak, country changes over time. Back in the 19th century, this was mostly Scandinavia. Today it's Japan. In another few years, it'll be South Korea. But the longest lived society has been steadily increasing at literally a linear pace. Every 4 years that passes, the average life expectancy in the healthiest society goes up by a year. 1 year for every 4. It's incredible. So from life expectancies that were in the 40s, 150 years ago, to now life expectancies in the 80s. Early on, a lot of this, so remember, this is average life expectancy at birth. So for most of human history, a lot of us died very young. I probably would have died very young from a pneumonia or some kind of infectious disease. So a lot of this early on is fixing childhood mortality. But for the last...
Is that skewed by early childhood mortality, or is that what one would expect if people make it through their first 3 to 5 years of life?
Well, the difference is less once you make it to adulthood. So the idea that average life expectancy was in the 40s 200 years ago doesn't mean that most people died before their 40s. If you made it to adulthood, there was a reasonable chance you'd make it to your 50s, 60s, even 70s. There's some great examples of generally, rich and privileged leaders going way back hundreds or thousands of years who were healthy into their 70s or 80s. But the average life expectancy is pulled down by infant mortality. So we made a lot of progress in reducing infant mortality throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Someone who lived then wouldn't recognize the reality of early childhood now. This is a huge triumph for humanity. But that's not this entire graph. That's just maybe the first part of this graph. The whole second half of this graph, the last 80 years, infant mortality has been low in most developed countries. And most of that second half of this graph, as life expectancy continues to climb, is actually that we are healthier as we're getting older. We're at lower risk of dying throughout our lives, even at the oldest ages. your likelihood of surviving from 80 to 85 is about twice what it was 30 or 40 years ago. So it's really remarkable. We're aging healthier throughout our lifespans. And so this has just kept going up and up. And there's a very rigorous debate among scientists about whether this is going to level off at some point, or it hasn't stopped yet. Is it going to just keep going? And most of this, of course, we don't have any medicines that treat aging right now, at least not that we're doing on purpose. So this is all public health. This is about healthy societies, food availability, healthy foods, sanitation, vaccines, routine medical treatment. This is all resulting in a revolution in human longevity. And that has some interesting effects. So, it's true. If you've heard people say that like 60 is the new 40, there's some truth to that. Being old isn't what it used to be. And we are generally healthier and more active for longer now. Not all of us, and that's important too. Health is not evenly distributed. We'll talk more about that in a sec. But one of the revolutions that's still sinking into medical care, and being a geriatrician, we're kind of on the front lines of this, is, we still don't learn a whole lot about the health of older adults. We often think of, there's kids and then there's adults. And most of what we know about medicine is about adults. And what does that mean? It usually means middle-aged people, 40s, 50s, 60s. But now, you can hit age, if your young adulthood, so to speak, your adulthood is from like 20 to 60, that's 40 years. You might have a whole nother 40 years of life left. And this is the concept of elderhood that's been popularized by one of my colleagues at UCSF, a wonderful geriatrician, Louise Aronson, who has a side gig, I guess, as an author. But she's written about how we need to change the way we think about medicine in particular, and society in general, for this idea that there's a whole nother stage of life that more and more of us are living longer and longer in. This idea of elderhood beyond adulthood. But this isn't for everyone, unfortunately. And some of you guys may have heard that life expectancy is not increasing in the US right now. It's actually been flat for the last 5 years or so. These are life expectancy curves for every state in the country, and the black line there is the US. So for most of the last 50 years, it's been steadily increasing, just like it is elsewhere in the world. But since 2010, 2011 or so, it's been flat. There's been a lot of discussion about why that is. Why are we different now? Why are we less healthy? And there are some answers to this, which are unfortunate. Sean, you can show the next slide where these are the best guesses at what is causing people to die more often younger than they did even 10 years ago. What's reversing this longevity trend in the U.S. So in particular, these are causes of death, age-specific mortality in middle age, 50s to 60s. And these are common causes of death, right? Lung disease from smoking, heart failure, diabetes, hypertension, but they're all increasing. And then there's problems like opiates, liver disease from alcohol, and suicide, which are also increasing. So you can kind of bin these in a couple of categories. One big category are diseases associated with obesity and metabolic disease. Heart failure, diabetes, hypertension. As we get more obese as a society, we're dying from these things more often and younger, and that's actually affecting our overall longevity. And then there's what some people call the diseases of desperation, or maybe these are diseases of disparities. Drug abuse, alcohol, and suicide, which have been rising for the past decade or so. So these are the problems we face now as a society in trying to, if we all want to be living healthier and longer and keep that up, we need to address these things in our society.
Speaking of which, so this section's on the concept of health span, calendar age versus physiological age. How might health span contribute to lifespan? What's the concept of compression of morbidity? And do centenarians avoid chronic diseases, or do they simply delay them until later? And to that previous point, how do we keep these diseases that accelerate aging at bay?
Yeah, this idea of health span versus lifespan, or calendar age versus physiological age, is really important, and not just for thinking about aging, but it's actually important for clinical care too. Um, so health span, some of you guys may have heard of this idea. So we're living longer. Does that actually mean that we're living healthier? So most of us will experience, different phases in our life. And one phase is when we're more healthy and we don't have many chronic diseases, we don't take many pills, and we're able to do the things we want to do, restrictions. Most of us, unfortunately, will have a period where we do have chronic diseases we're managing. We do take pills, and this affects our lives. We're less able to do things we want to do. A period of illness and eventually disability. Most people experience this at some point late in their life. So this is what we talk about with health span. How long are we living in that first part, and then how long are we living in that second part? Most of us, if you ask someone, do you want to live forever? Do you want to live to 150? Most of us would pause and ask, live how? Which part of my life are we talking about extending? Am I going to feel like I'm, disabled and dependent on others for 50 years, or am I going to be, playing tennis for 50 years? So that's the idea of health span versus lifespan. There's a lot of controversy about whether, as we are living longer in general in our society these days, are we extending the healthy part of life, the less healthy part of life, or both? And it seems like probably both. But ideally, we just would extend the healthy part of life and shorten the unhealthy part of life. This is what you see in centenarians, interestingly. So people who, for one reason or another, some of this is genetics, some of this is environment, some of this is luck. People who are healthy and free of chronic disease and independent into their 90s and 100s. And interestingly, centenarians really do have delayed onset of chronic diseases. Like a lot of people get heart disease in their 60s or 70s. A centenarian might get heart disease in their 90s or 100s. And then things are kind of compressed towards the end. So centenarians tend to have a very short period of disability. They're pretty healthy right up until the end. And for most of us, that seems like, I would buy into that. So centenarians are a great example of, a long health span that's already out there. And we're trying to figure out how we can help, the whole concept of geroscience is trying to figure out how to help everyone else live up like that, live a long, healthy lifespan. I mentioned earlier, you can go forward to the next part about heart disease. What's the role of aging in this, as opposed to just being really careful about managing your disease risk factors? And I love this demonstration from Steve Ostad, who's an aging biologist down in Alabama, one of the leaders in understanding the mechanisms of how we age. And hypertension, smoking, cholesterol, diabetes, these are all really important risk factors for cardiovascular disease, for heart disease. And it's really important to manage them effectively to reduce our chance of having heart attacks and strokes, and this works. But on the next slide, you put this next to the risk that comes from aging, and those all just shrink. If we could just chip off part of that risk from aging, make your age-related heart disease risk when you're 70 the same as it was when you're 40, it would revolutionize cardiology. And that's true for every other disease field too. So you put these all together, and the idea is that if you target the common underlying biology, the aging mechanisms that contribute to all these different chronic diseases, you can have a huge impact. Because what really tends to affect our health is not usually just one thing, but it's usually many things that happen all around the same time together and just add up. That's called multimorbidity. The idea of when you have one chronic disease and then a second one and then a third one and then a fourth one. And this is an expression of aging. As our aging advances, our risk of these chronic diseases goes up. And so you tend to see diseases coming in clumps like that. You can try to treat each one individually, but the limit to that is that if you treat one perfectly, the other one might get you. So if you can treat all of them together, prevent all of them through targeting aging, that can really have a huge impact on people's health. We talked already a bit about centenarians. This is some data for those of you who like to dive into the nitty-gritty. This is a description of a group of people who lived, who were healthy and living into their 90s, their hundreds, past 105, and even super centenarians to 110. And left here, these are curves of their disease-free survival. So in other words, they weren't just alive, they weren't just living, they were healthy. The black bar is the rest of us. The rest of us, so 50, you can look at where do 50% of us tend to get our first major problem, our first major disease. It looks like that's around somewhere in our 60s. But for people who were healthy in their 90s, that was around 85. For the super centenarians, the light blue line there, it's like 105. So it's not that centenarians are living longer with major health problems. They're living really healthier longer. And the idea of compressing disability at the very end is on the right side here, percent of their life with disease. You can see for super centenarians at the bottom there, it's very, very little. It's like 5% of their life is spent managing diseases. For most of us, the controls up at the top, it's more like 20% of our life. So this is the ideal that they already have this biology. We're trying to understand it so we can give it to everyone else too. So a great intro to talk about that biology. So I mentioned already the hallmarks of aging. So these are the pathways that we've learned through genetics and through other experiments over the last few decades that control how we age. And Sean, you can show the next slide. I want to share with you guys how I think about how I kind of categorize this stuff in my head. Why do we age on a biological level? And it's really three components. The third one we'll walk in a bit. One component, like I said earlier, is damage. So as we live our lives, damage happens. This is like, rust building up on a car. And this is inevitable. This is entropy. If you carefully fold something, it'll eventually unfold. And I mentioned our mitochondria. We produce damage as an inevitable side effect of life, of making energy. So things like DNA damage, misfolded proteins. Now we're learning more about epigenetic damage, damage to how our cells regulate which genes are expressed when, telomere shortening. These are all forms of molecular damage, and a buildup of this molecular damage definitely contributes to aging. But it's not just the damage, it's that if you get damage in the right spots, that can cause problems of its own, like whole new categories of problems. I'm calling this the consequences of damage on the right here. So, so an example of this that's familiar to most people is cancer. Cancer is a problem whose root is in DNA damage, mutations. But you get enough mutations and you cause a cancer cell, and cancer is its own threat to our health. There are other examples of these. If you damage stem cells enough, stem cells stop working, and then you can't replenish your tissues. If you damage mitochondria, you can't produce enough energy, and then your cells don't have the energy to do all the other things that they need to do. Chronic inflammation is part of this. When you get damage in the right spots, our bodies tend to accumulate this chronic systemic inflammation that contributes to a lot of diseases of aging. Senescent cells is another example of this. Senescent cells are cells that are damaged, and they might become cancer cells, but they still hang on to enough control to kind of switch themselves off so that they don't become a cancer cell. They turn off their ability to divide. But they don't just sit there. They release inflammatory proteins. And we think actually that senescent cells, which accumulate, they have a normal function, right? So everything in our bodies has a normal function, so do senescent cells. But they accumulate with age, and they get kind of out of control. and they contribute to this chronic inflammation that can contribute to other diseases like heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. So this is kind of the framework. There's the damage and the consequences. This is all bad news, but there's good news too. So show the third category, which is that our bodies actually do have robust mechanisms to cope with all of this, to repair damage, to clean out these consequences. This is why we live as long as we do. We humans, if you look at species by species in the tree of evolution, we live a really long time. And this is because we are so well optimized to cope with damage. These repair pathways are what give us our resilience as we age. But the repair pathways start to fade as we get older, and then that upsets the balance that we showed earlier between damage and repair. But we can try to boost these repair pathways. What we've learned in the laboratory is that it may seem like it makes sense that if you can stop the damage, you'll live longer. But actually what we found is that more important is boosting the repair pathways. And there's many different ways to do this. But if you can make that repair more effective and last longer, you can make organisms live longer. One big way to do this, so you see the knife and the fork there representing the control of the repair pathways. So it turns out a lot of these repair pathways are controlled by nutrition, or more accurately, by how our cells sense the presence and abundance of nutrients and energy. This idea that our cells will shift back and forth between, if there's not a lot of energy, not a lot of nutrition, they kind of hunker down and try to themselves. But if there is a lot of energy and a lot of nutrition, they'll go forth and divide and grow. And of course, there's periods in our life when we want to grow and periods in our life when we want to repair what we have. In general, we found that being in that repair mode more often is good for healthy longevity in the laboratory. And there are many ways to manipulate this in the laboratory through things like fasting and dietary restriction, which go back decades in the science of aging. But now we realize that things like fasting and dietary restriction work through very specific molecular sensing pathways. And we can kind of control these molecular sensing pathways and kind of cut out the fasting part and just get into the turning on repair part. This is what's led to many of the drugs that are currently entering clinical trials to target aging mechanisms. They work by turning on these, bypassing the energy sensors or the nutrient sensors and turning on these repair pathways in our own cells. So you can fast forward past this part. I think we just talked through it. This is just the idea of, again, how nutrition is so important for regulating these metabolic sensors, these energy sensors that then control our cells' repair pathways.
This is something you brought up, I think probably a year plus ago when I was with you at the Buck, this notion that insulin is one of the principal signals for aging. And all of this whole concepts you're just talking about just relates so much to what I think we're trying to achieve at Jumpstart around improving people's health span, reversing some of these metabolic diseases associated with inflammation and associated with insulin resistance, and how might that have an impact ultimately on their health span and thus longevity.
Yeah, when we first started talking a couple of years ago, this really struck me that, I just talked about nutrition and energy sensing and how this is so integral to the science of aging, and then to hear you talk about how important insulin and energy sensing and nutrient sensing is to metabolic disease. I realized we're kind of talking about the same stuff, and this is really true, and it goes back to the very kind of beginnings of aging as a science. This fun fact with your audience here. We often use simple model organisms like worms to study aging. And that probably sounds crazy to a lot of people. What does a worm have to teach us about how you or I ages or about our health? A worm has like 1,000 cells. It's that big. It lives for 3 weeks. What could it possibly tell us?
There it is.
But yeah, so 25 years ago, when the first couple of scientists, Tom Johnson, Cynthia Kenyon, set out to try to understand the genetics of lifespan, and this sounded crazy back then, they used the same model that they used to study the genetics of anything else. They used a simple worm. And the very first gene they found, where a single gene could affect the lifespan of this worm dramatically. It actually, a mutation in this gene could more than double the lifespan of this little worm. That first gene turned out to be the worm's version of the insulin receptor. And then since then, this is, I guess I'll show you on the next slide, but so since then, this has been mapped out in great detail in worms, and then in mice and in humans too. That as you kind of walk through the insulin and the insulin-like growth factor pathways, so worms don't have. This is why it's so weird, right? Worms don't have a pancreas. They don't even have insulin the way that we do. They have a single nutrient growth pathway that's the equivalent of both insulin and IGF, insulin-like growth factor. But as you map out this pathway in worms, you mutate all the genes, they all affect lifespan, and all in the same directions. If you have more signal through insulin, that's bad for lifespan. If you have less signal through insulin, that's good for lifespan. And this has then been kind of moved into other organisms too. In mice, for example, you can the insulin situation in mice and humans is complicated because insulin has different effects on different parts of the body, and we're still kind of trying to understand what insulin resistance really means. We need some insulin to survive, right? So we can't just like knock out our insulin receptors. So insulin's a little more complicated, but the theme is the same. You generally want to have less of an insulin signal to be healthier longer in the laboratory. This is more obviously true for insulin-like growth factor, IGF. There have been one of the very first Methuselah mice, strain of mice that lives much longer than normal, almost twice as long as a normal mouse, doesn't produce growth hormone, which is the hormone that controls IGF. And throughout the growth hormone IGF signaling pathway, you can switch this back and forth like a thermostat. Turn up the signaling and mice don't live as long. Turn down the signaling, mice live longer. So this has been a common theme throughout evolution, from the little tiny worm up to us, that this nutrient-responsive growth signal that in the worms is encapsulated by this insulin IGF receptor. In general, less of that is better for a longer life. And we even now see this in centenarians. So there's been a huge effort to understand the genetics of centenarians, right? Trying to find like the longevity gene. Wouldn't it be great? And I think we know now that the longevity gene doesn't exist in humans. We're complex. But the kind of the second step was, well, if there's not a single gene, is there some pattern that you can see in the genetics of centenarians? And indeed, there's some hints now that the pattern that you see in centenarians is that they tend to have mutations, changes in one of these genes that takes part of the insulin or IGF signaling pathways, just like you see in the worms. And so probably, this is the case in centenarians too, that turning these nutrient signals up or down is probably helping to make centenarians live longer too. So it's just incredible to me how tightly linked nutrients and metabolism and aging are. All the things, Sean, that you talk about with controlling insulin resistance and managing glucose and reducing the need for insulin. That's the same stuff that we talk about in the aging world, about reducing the signal through this insulin growth pathway in order to live healthier longer. It's really kind of incredible how, and it almost makes me think of metabolic syndrome and obesity as like an accelerated aging state, right? Like maybe the whole idea that obesity, diabetes is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, for example. There's probably some very specific molecular explanations for that. But probably part of that is also that obesity and metabolic syndrome are accelerating aging in general throughout the body. And that's probably contributing to aging-related problems that develop. Really, really fascinating.
Yeah, no, that has always made sense to me. And part of the reason we get so excited about trying to reverse it, honestly, because it feels like
Yeah,
it's such a major risk factor for all those chronic diseases, and to your point, really accelerating their onset. Wow.
no. So I guess we can't escape talking a bit about metformin. We'll have to do it a little bit quickly, but I'm sure there are some folks in the audience who are wondering about this.
And just a little bit of context too. I wanted this on here partly because we've been prescribing metformin a fair share recently, off-label to help facilitate weight loss as a kind of, and also partly as that concept of it's an insulin sensitizer, but also to delay the progression of type 2 diabetes and potentially get a point here, to promote longevity, which is obviously preliminary, but all those things seem like a great fit for us. So we have been.
Yeah, so we can talk a bit about the science behind that. So metformin's a really good drug for diabetes, right? And one of the reasons it's a really good drug is it was the first drug for diabetes that was clearly shown to improve longevity in people with type 2 diabetes, right? More so than insulin or other drugs that produce more insulin. After what I just said, that might actually make a little bit of sense. It's not, you need insulin, of course, to prevent hyperglycemia, but you really need to also get at the root cause. And maybe metformin does that. So we've realized now, this is a super complicated figure from Nir Barzilai, who's a scientist at Albert Einstein, who was trying to create a randomized controlled trial of metformin in longevity. More about that in a sec. But just showing the many different ways that metformin intersects with pathways related to aging. We talked about insulin and IGF signaling. Metformin clearly helps to improve insulin signaling, meaning to fight insulin resistance in a helpful way. It affects the way mitochondria function. It intersects with these other nutrient signals. There's all kinds of links between metformin and pathways related to aging. So on the next slide, just a cartoon to show that, this is all from the laboratory, remember, but in the laboratory at least, there's reasons to think that metformin affects these pathways of aging and has secondary effects then on the broader picture of aging biology. Even things like mitochondrial function and senescence. So metformin is a really interesting molecule. And in studies, I guess you can go to the next slide. So metformin, molecule that's been chosen for the first large randomized controlled trial of a drug to try to target aging. This is called TAME, Targeting Aging with Metformin. It's a large randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial, more than 3,000 people. Half of them will be randomized to take metformin for more than 3 years. Why metformin? Well, because of these molecular hints that it seems to target aging pathways. It extends the lifespan of animals in the laboratory too. But it's such a well-studied drug in the context of diabetes that there are some intriguing hints from that kind of came out of the side effects of studying metformin in diabetes. And by side effects, I mean, for example, observing that metformin reduces mortality in diabetics, which is why it's a first-line drug. Hints from randomized controlled trials that metformin might reduce cardiovascular disease in diabetics. Sean, you alluded to taking metformin to prevent diabetes. That's the result of a large randomized controlled trial, the diabetes prevention program, that showed that if you're at risk for diabetes, if you're pre-diabetes, taking metformin can slow or prevent you from getting diabetes. Exercise and diet changes are even better, but metformin worked also. So all these hints that metformin is more than just a diabetes drug. It's, as you said, a pretty safe drug. We know the major issues around it. We know how to prescribe it safely. And so it was selected for this big proof of concept study. This is going to be the first study to see if we can target aging, measure that as a clinical trial outcome, and test the geroscience hypothesis. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you about. So what is this clinical trial actually going to test? So first, it's going to enroll, it's going to recruit people in their 60s and 70s, people who are at risk for a major disease related to aging. And by at risk, it means they already have one major disease related to aging, like heart disease, or they're at risk because we can measure their physiological age, for example, by measuring their gait speed, and show that they're at higher risk for getting a major disease of aging. And then the outcome of the clinical trial, what are we going to measure? What are we trying to achieve? I say we, I'm not involved in this at all. What is the TAME study group trying to achieve? They're trying to achieve a delay in when people get additional major chronic diseases, but not just one, any of a whole bunch of them. So heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, you can see on the slide there, cancer, dementia, or dying. This is really the first of its kind. It's the first clinical trial that's not just trying to prevent one disease, but trying to prevent any of a whole basket of diseases. And the geroscience hypothesis is that this is what targeting aging should do. If you're affecting the aging process that leads to all of these things, well, then you should slow them all down. We should be able to detect that in a clinical trial. So that's the promise of TAME. We don't know the answer yet, and we're not going to know the answer for 3 or 5 years. But last I heard, TAME is actually underway. So all the usual caveats, metformin is promising enough that I think this trial makes a lot of sense. We don't know if it's actually going to work yet. If it does work, we're only going to know that it works in the people who were involved in the trial. We may try to extrapolate, it'll work for other people too, but we're really only going to know based on what the trial specifically tests. And most clinical trials don't work. That's important for folks to keep in mind. So we'll see what happens. I think there's a lot of promise to it. And I'm really, really excited that we're actually going to be able to, that these folks are pushing forward to do this important clinical trial and really see. I guess this will be the last slide here, but just to say, this is meant to be the first of many clinical trials that target aging through geroscience mechanisms. New drugs or repurposed drugs like metformin that target these mechanisms of aging. And then, how do you test these things in clinical trials? Well, metformin, the TAME study, is going to test multimorbidity, right? Whether an aging intervention can slow a bunch of chronic diseases altogether. You could also target geriatric syndromes, or we talked about resilience, like recovering from a hip fracture. You could see if a geroscience drug makes it more likely people will recover faster and return to their health. So it's a really exciting time to be a geriatrician and a geroscientist, as this field is really emerging and starting and generating these interventions, and all these clinical trials are starting to happen. It's going to be a really exciting few years.
That seems like a broad question. But I don't know. Timing wise, I don't know if that's too big of a question to answer at this point, but on a practical level, I don't know if you could try and address that sort of high level really, because I think that does speak to everybody's probably underlying question, hearing some of your thoughts like, well, gosh, but what can I do about it? Or what should I prioritize in terms of what can have the biggest impact on expanding my health span, promoting my longevity, and really vibrant longevity like my youth.
Well, I'm gonna put my geriatrician hat on to answer this one. I'll do the 30-second version, which is that 1, 2, 3 through 10 are to be more active. And if that's exercise, that's great, but just be more active and mobile and do things as best you can, no matter where you are in your life in terms of your ability to be active and do things. Do a little bit more and work that into your daily routine. There is so much data.
You consider that
about how important
exercise, or being like, you define that as exercise or more active? I don't know.
Exercise is great. Exercise can scare people because it sounds like it's hard to do. Right. And the point is to do more all the time. If some of that is exercise, that's great. But if you can design your life to be more active without having to call it exercise, that's great too.
Yeah.
You know, walking more, doing stairs more, doing hikes more. You know, I think the key thing is that it's not about, you know, just being on a treadmill,
Right.
but it's about how active you are throughout your day, throughout your life.
Right. No, that makes good sense.
And then the other, so that's like 1 through 10, because we've learned how important that is at every stage of life, every stage of aging. But certainly healthy nutrition, you know, trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle and a normal weight is very helpful. Paying attention to medical problems and, you know, nutrition and lifestyle are part of that. You know, don't let things go by the wayside. Make sure that when problems come up, you address them. You know, get your vaccines, do your health screenings, watch your blood pressure, all these kind of boring things that can add up over time. So pay attention to your health and be connected. We've actually learned a lot about how important that is to stay mentally, you know, active and involved, and stay connected to people, whatever that means for you. Because Sean, I'm a total introvert, so my version of connecting to people is different from, you know, an extrovert's version of connecting to people. But whatever that means to you, you know, be connected, because we've actually learned a lot about how important that is for our long-term health too. So that's the geriatrician's hat.
That's a great hat. You have time to comment about these last? I think we have like 2 more slides here, but.
I really should wrap up and run. I need to be on another Zoom talking right at noon, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, let me just look at the last slides, because some of them just touch on the buck, which for people who are interested in this subject, you know, we founded Jumpstart with the notion of, hey, we want to use proven science to help improve people's health and well-being, promote their longevity, promote their health span. Some of the way we do that is to try to, you know, make contacts with people like Dr. Newman, who's doing cutting edge research at his institution, the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, to learn what interventions, you know, how can, to that previous slide, what can I do to make a difference? And so to try to take that science ultimately and apply it to people's lives in a way that can help, again, promote health and well-being. So
yeah, check out the Buck's website. When there's not a global pandemic, we do tours and lots of in-person activities. These days, we have a lot of you know, remote Zoom programs that you might be interested in tuning into. So, so yeah, if this is interesting, check out our website.
It's a great resource for, you know, looking at proven science to help promote people's longevity, promote their health span, live better lives. So highly recommend it. Fascinating place. Now you'll all know what it is when you drive north on the 101 passing Nevada and you look up on the left. And if you're super excited about it, yes, there's an opportunity to become a member, which is something I was reminding myself I need to do when I was reviewing these the other day. So with that, I don't think we have time for questions, but I want to thank Dr. Newman in particular for joining us today. I thought that was fascinating and really appreciate the opportunity to engage. And of course, want to thank all of you for joining us today as well. And look forward to more great health webinars. I think Dr. Newman was talking about doing potentially re-engaging in October or sometime in the future to talk about ketones as signaling molecules and how nutritional ketosis can also potentially have a positive impact on people's longevity. Another fascinating topic. So
yeah, I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you again.
All right, thanks a lot, Sean, and thank all of you for tuning in and listening.
Thank you.